So between the Great Depression and the next great cataclysm, World War II, you were in and out of a couple of different college campuses.
Oh, yeah.
And I understand the Coconut Grove fit in that path.
Now, you weren't going to bring that up. I thought we agreed that you wouldn't bring that up.
I just brought it up. I don't know how you're going to answer the question.
Well, I'll just tell you. I'll tell you about it because I went to Art Center school because I got out of high school at the midterm, and I had to go to school until the next fall, so I went to Art Center, which was and is a very, very fine school of design in Los Angeles. And I really enjoyed art school, and I almost stayed for a while, except that I was succeeded in getting admitted to USC. Now, I have to tell you about this because nobody else would admit me. But those of you who knew USC the way it was then, those of you who know the way it is now, it's okay. This doesn't apply because I don't want to get in trouble. But USC had a very good school of architecture, but it was a country club in all other respects. And I was under the influence of year older friends. They were all that year so older than I. And we just spent our time at the Coconut Grove. I mean, you know, for those of you who don't know, this was a very fancy and wonderful, famous nightclub in the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles. Freddie Martin's orchestra and Ray Noble and all those marvelous old people. And so I went to my dad one day when I was finishing up the sophomore year, and I said, you know, I've got to get out of here. He said, why? And I said, because I'm not using your money well. My dad put me through college. I earned a little bit spending money, and that was all. But I explained to him that he and my mother didn't really know what was going on with this, my hanging out in these nightclubs. But I told him, I said, I'll never be an architect at the rate I'm going. So I applied to 4 universities, MIT, Cornell, Berkeley, and the University of Washington. And MIT accepted me. Why they accepted me, I have the foggiest notion. Because I was hardly making a C average. You had to make a C average at USC to stay into what they called university extension. And I was making a C average, amazingly. And so I had the opportunity to go to either University of Washington or MIT. And I chose Washington. I couldn't possibly tell you why. But it was one of the most creative, intelligent, wonderful things I ever did in my life was to go to that school. Because I got a magnificent education in architecture. I could go into the details of that, but it was a marvelous experience, which I am so grateful for. I can't tell you. There are a lot of things in your life, you know, as you get to be my age, that you're grateful for. And going to that school and graduating from that school with those people was one of the finest things that I ever did.
And at the time, you were able to witness what you've termed as this grand regionalism that is somewhat lost in architecture today. The gateway from Japan, more or less, was Seattle. So you experienced probably a different Seattle than the rest of us.
Well, you know, those were years. I think we all have to recognize that as our culture changes, the very essence of our experience changes. What I went through in those years is nothing like the young people today are having here in San Diego, for instance. Their life and their time is valuable, is wonderful. They have a great future, but they don't have what we had at that time. And one of the things we had was regionalism. Regionalism in architecture has died. There is none such thing anymore in America. But the Pacific Northwest, Oregon and Seattle, or Portland and Seattle, had a regional residential architecture which bled over into a lot of the commercial architecture. And it was influenced mostly by Japan because Japan, as Keith says, was the cultural and economic and political entry from the Orient into the United States. So there was a great deal of, in the local architecture, not copying Japanese, but being influenced by many of the principles that Japanese buildings traditionally always possessed. For those of you who have been to Japan, the Summer Palace in Kyoto, for instance, is a wonderfully significant building in terms of the principles and the aesthetics and the beauty of Japanese residential architecture. So Seattle also had an influence from the Indian culture. People don't recognize that much anymore, but there was a lot of influence on the part of the way the Indians built in wood. So the third influence that made the architecture of the Pacific Northwest what it is, or was, are those three elements. And they're very, very important to the understanding of that wonderful architecture that evolved and was at its peak when I got there in 1938. And went on with that generation or two generations of architects to become very significant. Now, other areas of our country have done that. The Bay Area of San Francisco, Berkeley, for instance, developed a regional modernist architecture based upon modernist principles that was absolutely unique to the country. You can find those houses now, and the closest we come to them are those houses, the wooden houses in Del Mar, our neighbor. Del Mar, a lot of the architects who built some of the significant residences in Del Mar were very much influenced by the regional architecture of the Bay Area.
So after or during broken apart your studies and some military service, I understand had things gone another way, you might have found yourself on the beaches of Normandy.
Oh, I could have. I went in the Army. The Navy wouldn't take me because I couldn't see anything. But the Army didn't want me to see anything. I think. That wasn't the idea in the Army. But I got into something called the Combat Engineers, which was a phony name because all they did was teach you to be a soldier, shoot a musket, you know, and all that, and blow up things. We had many wonderful experiences blowing up things in basic training. But right at the end of basic training, for reasons which don't matter now, I was discharged because they discovered I had asthma, poor old asthma. And so they sent me home from the hospital. I never went, got into the hospital circuitously, and all my stuff was back in my locker, you know, in the barracks. And they never let me out of the hospital for 2 months. I hung around there, read all the books in the library, and talked to the nurses and so forth, male nurses. And too bad. But finally they discharged me, and I came home. And here I was with no friends. They were all in the service. But I went back to the University of Washington because I had 1 quarter left, and the Army drafted me 1 quarter before I graduated. I went back and got my degree. And there were no friends in Seattle. Here were all these girls. You know, the university was just flooded with girls. If I got a date during that period, I always had 6 girls. I never could have 1 date. I always had 5 or 6. But at any rate, there was no reason for me to stay in Seattle. It was typically cold and rainy. And so I went home. And that's when I arranged to work for the office of Myron Hunt and Harold Chambers.